So to meet their net zero carbon goals, universities have got to get to grips with scope 3, and that's where travel fits in. It's typically about 20% of most universities' scope 3 emissions. The trouble is, procurement directors across the country are telling us that travel is like a switch that was turned off during the pandemic, but has now been switched back on again. Travel's quickly going back to how it was pre-COVID. On the upside, it's an area where we've got significant flexibility in the choices that we make. There's clearly scope to reduce business travel, but you shouldn't underestimate the challenge of this. It requires a fundamental shift in behaviours that Janice has just outlined, actually. So let's have a quick look at some of the good practice in the sector. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Edinburgh developed the sector-leading business travel hierarchy as long ago as 2016 to help staff and managers to make better informed decisions about their travel. The very first question is, do you need to travel at all, or would a video call suffice? Something that's even more relevant post-pandemic. It's an easy to follow graphic, neatly split to help you navigate local, national, international travel. And there's some clear principles that sit with it. So don't fly for domestic travel, fly economy, and upgrade on the train so that you can work and get a better experience. Travel also has to be booked using the university's travel management company. And unsurprisingly, I think this approach has been widely adopted across the sector. It mirrors commercial good practice. No one's really doing anything too radical in this space. But Edinburgh also published their travel data, and they do that at a really granular level, at a business unit level. But they also provide a really good example of how hard it is to change behaviour. So in the 3 years following the introduction of the hierarchy, pre-COVID, business travel actually went up every year. Having the policy, the process, the measurement is absolutely great, but it won't work without culture change. If you can flick us on to the next slide, please. Swansea University has adopted some clear overarching principles along with the travel hierarchy approach. They've done a really good job there at looking at targets, mapping out how they're actually going to get to net zero carbon by 2035. And when you look at business travel, it's actually pretty frightening. In 2019-20, which let's not forget was a year truncated by COVID, essentially stopping travel for about 5 months of the year, their emissions at Swansea for business travel were 1,200 tonnes of CO2. Not huge for the sector, 1,200 tonnes of CO2. Their target was just 262 tonnes. And those targets that they've mapped out only decrease going forwards. But can your university function and meet its strategic objectives if it reduces business travel by 80, 90%? Almost certainly not. So while Swansea emphasise the need to remove, reduce, replace travel carbon emissions, they also recognise that it will be necessary to offset, particularly when they're talking about unavoidable travel. I also want to share the example of Lund University in Sweden. Led by their Centre for Sustainability Studies, they advocate ground travel for destinations within 12 hours, essentially across the whole of Europe. But what I particularly like about the Lund approach, and this is something that I think will resonate with Janice, is their recognition of the importance of culture change and the desire to stimulate a low carbon culture by resisting our own fear of missing out from not attending everything, and by encouraging academics to champion low carbon research careers rather than go down the more traditional route. If you can flick us on, please, to the next slide, Patrick. Thank you. Reducing carbon is a primary consideration for universities as they seek to define their approach to travel. But you also need to look at this in the round. So when it comes to flying, choosing a lower carbon option like flying direct or flying in a newer plane is something that you can choose to do. But it's often the more expensive option. The same budget will buy you greener flights, but fewer of them. And it's really, really important that you factor in the human cost of travel. So making sure that employees are well rested and fit to do their jobs at the end of a long journey, that they're safe and well in what may be unfamiliar surroundings. So for instance, your travel policy may advocate using public transport on arrival at a destination. But lone travellers, vulnerable travellers, travellers to unusual destinations will probably feel safer taking a licensed taxi, even if the carbon impact is greater. Different institutions are going to set different priorities when it comes to considering the carbon cost versus the financial one, but it's absolutely essential that the needs of the traveller are foremost in your considerations. If you could flip me onto my final slide, please. It's just one example of the many trade-offs that you'll need to think through as you define policy and institutional culture. Differing strategic priorities can muddy the waters. Is carbon reduction aligned with your internationalisation strategy? How can you provide global opportunities for students and staff when you're trying to reduce your travel carbon footprint? The key is to make it everyone's responsibility, arming employees and students with the tools they need to make better decisions. That's really important. Clear policies, advice frameworks, a good travel management company that gives you good data, good choices, accurate data and reporting. But to ensure that this is a truly shared agenda taken seriously across the institution, you actually need some devolved responsibility, at least to head of school, head of professional service level. They need to own this. They need to manage travel carbon budgets as well as their travel finance budgets. They need to be able to weigh up the relative merits of different travel business cases and assess their value to the organisation and indeed to the individual. It's not going to be easy, but it's only through changing the culture and having shared accountability that universities are going to be able to move the dial on this absolutely essential agenda. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joel, for that very comprehensive and very crisp and brisk coverage through those issues.